I just want to take us for a moment to northwest Brazil, to a region where a young boy, 15-year-old boy, Felipe, lives. For those of you who might not be familiar with Amazonas region in northwest Brazil, it's the largest state in Brazil. It's also one of the most sparsely populated. The majority of the state is covered by tropical forest, and most of the 1,000 small communities are scattered along rivers that are accessible primarily by boats. Of the 62 municipalities there, only 6 are connected by road to the capital, Manaus, where 2.5 million people live, and the other 2 million are scattered along these small communities along riverways. For certain destinations, to travel by boat can take days, days, weeks, or even months to reach the capital. So given all this, you can imagine what a daunting task it is to transport teachers and students and materials and supplies in a region like this. In 2015, Felipe is one of 2 young people who are attending from his village, a second year of high school. A decade ago, Felipe would have had 2 options. Either 1, pack up and travel and move to the capital, Manaus, in order to finish his high school, or 2, stop studying altogether. But today, Felipe is one of 300,000 young people who have benefited from a program that was initiated by the state of Amazonas called Media Center. Media Center uses digital technology in order to stream, satellite digital technology, in order to stream live classes from an expert lecturing teacher at a studio in the capital in Manaus, out to 1,000 classrooms or centers around the rural areas outside of the capital in Amazonas. In turn, the students who are sitting in these various classrooms can participate and present their ideas back not only to the lecturing teachers, but to all the other thousands of students who are participating. For us at the Center for Universal Education, we've been particularly interested in Media Center, as well as many other cases of where we've seen large-scale improvement not only on the access front, but also on the learning front, and particularly for disadvantaged or marginalized populations. For the past year and a half, we've been embarked on a project called Millions Learning, where we've been looking at a range of case studies and other evidence to, 1, identify where and how have effective learning interventions scaled, 2, to draw from those cases and evidence what are some of the underlying factors or forces that have contributed to, or in some cases impeded the process of more children going to school and learning. 3, with the aim to synthesize this information and to distill some findings and recommendations that could hopefully contribute to future scaling efforts around getting more children and young people learning. We think that this conversation is all the more pertinent today with the recent unveiling of the Sustainable Development Goals. And as the world's attention is increasingly focused and will be focused on this question of implementation, how do we actually meet these extremely ambitious goals? We think it's a great moment for education. A lot of attention focused on education in its own right, as well as its instrumental role in reaching the other goals. But we also know too well that business as usual is not going to get us there. At current pace, it's estimated that it'll take 126 years, 6 generations, for the average scoring student in developing countries to reach the levels of the average scoring student in a developed country today, 6 generations. Therefore, we need to urgently identify not only what is working, but how it can work at large scale. Here are some of the case studies that we've been examining as part of this project. They range from early childhood development to post-primary education in various low and middle income countries around the world. While I won't have time to go into the details of these case studies and others we've been looking at, there are just 3 quick points I want to underscore that have come out by looking at these cases. The first is these cases demonstrate that it's not about scaling the organization or the policy or merely increasing numbers, but it's really about scaling impact. That we know that the quality of education is about the entire system, not a particular project, not a particular policy. And this really requires a different appreciation for scale and a different type of investment and the types of partnerships that are needed, the timeframes involved, and the financing. I think Teach for All, of which Teach First is a member, is a great example of that, where my understanding is, at the end of the day, Teach for All isn't looking to train enough teachers in every country to fill the shortage of teachers in those countries, but it's really seeking to train and prepare enough young education leaders to catalyze the change that's needed in those countries, the impact. The second point that comes out very strongly in looking at these cases is that there's no one recipe to scale, that scaling takes a variety of approaches, from a more deliberate replication, say a franchise model like McDonald's, to a more organic process of diffusion or spread that perhaps we've seen with Facebook or Uber. At the same time, it takes a number of different pathways, expanding geographically, covering more regions, more countries, more areas, while also at times institutionalizing a model or approach within a national system. And what we found is that these are not mutually exclusive, and more often than not, these pathways are pursued simultaneously. And thirdly, what we've seen throughout these case studies is the vast majority of them have originated outside of the formal system. They were initiated by non-state and state entities, actors, but often in a new, chaotic, unregulated space, under the radar, so to speak, where they had the opportunity to experiment and iterate while not being threatening to the status quo. And then it really became a story about how they were able to expand and get integrated into the formal system over time. So while there are various pathways and approaches that are taken, there are some common patterns or findings that are emerging. I'm going to briefly share some of what appear to be contributing to scaling learning interventions and where additional action as well we believe is needed. We found that when it comes to scaling learning interventions, it requires implementers that, one, plan for scale from the outset. Even with the most effective innovations, we know that scaling can't be assumed to happen, that it just doesn't happen spontaneously, but it actually requires deliberate, thoughtful preparation from the start. We know that the gold-plated bells and whistle models are extremely difficult to retrofit for scale after the fact. This involves a number of different things, one of which requires identifying what are those core components that should look the same regardless of where it's being scaled to, and what are those aspects that are much more flexible, that not only can be adapted, but must be adapted to a local context. An example there that I think is helpful is when it comes to Sesame Street. Sesame Street, the world's largest informal educator of young children today. It's been around for more than 40 years, reaching millions of young children in more than 150 countries. So what Sesame Street has done is they have a universal framework that has a universal style, a target audience, core learning goals, but then they leave it to each individual country to adapt it to its local context, addressing the children's unique learning needs and what those countries' learning goals are. The second finding is that scaling requires a certain aptitude, let's say, for opportunism. That it's not about creating parallel structures, but it's really about responding to an urgent problem and priority of the state. We found that these cases demonstrated that innovation was much more likely to take root and spread when it really was addressing a priority and a problem of the state. And thirdly, we found that the cases demonstrated this drive to constantly innovate and strengthen what they're doing by using evidence and data. That these cases invested in and really had an appreciation for the role that evidence plays, and evidence in a variety of forms. And this include, I'd say, a refreshing openness and honesty about not only what was working, but where things were not working, and taking a courageous step to drop and not do more of what wasn't working. Pratham Education Foundation, one of the largest education NGOs in India, took this courageous step. Back in 2008, they were reaching 30 million children in partnership with the government. But at that point, they decided to actually scale back quite significantly as they found some of the results and impact was being diluted. Scaling learning certainly involves partnering, working with the public sector. And this calls for one that is open and adaptive. It requires a number of things, one of which is setting clear education goals, but with flexibility about how to achieve them. About setting a monitoring system that tracks progress towards meeting those goals, but not only tracks it, but that shares that information widely. We know it's very difficult to design a solution if we don't know what the problem is. And thirdly, it's about having a transparent regulatory environment that is supportive of an innovative education community, and one that's comprised of a multiplicity of actors. Again, when it comes to education, and in particular quality education, it's very unusual to find one actor that can design, deliver, and finance at scale. And what we've seen through these case studies and other evidence is it takes a hybrid of partnerships. That it's not just the government as a sole provider, but it really is the government as providing a platform for a variety of different people to contribute ideas and to solve problems. And lastly, it requires a committed and flexible funder. Many of the cases we looked at benefited from an early investor or funder. That one encouraged a culture of innovation, research, and development, a real recognition that scaling is not a linear process. It doesn't start at research and then result in action at scale. But it really is this cyclical, iterative process where lessons are learned and course corrections are made along the way. Secondly, and relatedly, these cases benefited often from funders that had a certain comfort with risk-taking and comfort with failures. And in fact, they didn't look at them as failures, but they looked at them as learning opportunities. And lastly, many of these cases benefited from the long-term support from funders. On average, the cases had support for over 10 years, as well as a recognition of the type of core support that was needed in order to scale. Oftentimes it's difficult to find, I think, this kind of core support and a drive to keep overhead costs low, but a recognition that in order to scale, certain systems need to be in place, data collection systems, certain initial investments in capital in terms of automating systems that in the long run will generate cost efficiencies in the long run are needed. So I think just to conclude, I would say, despite I think sometimes our frustration at the slow pace of change in education, we've seen that large-scale progress in learning is possible, and it's possible in some of the most difficult areas and marginalized communities. And at the same time, I think that there's so much that we can continue to learn from and build on these experiences and others to ensure that there are millions of more Felipes around the world who have the opportunity not only to go to school, but to stay in school and ensure they're learning valuable skills while they're there. So thank you.